You don't realize it when it happens, and that is exactly the problem. The first boundary a manipulator breaks on you doesn't feel like a boundary. Sounds like education. It feels like empathy. It feels like maturity. But it's not. Let me ask you something, and answer honestly, even if it's just in your head. How many times have you accepted something that bothered you, just to not seem rude? Maybe you ignored a strange comment. Maybe you laughed at something that disrespected you. Maybe I said okay when everything clearly wasn't okay. And at that moment, you didn't see a problem, but there, exactly there, something started. This video is not about obvious manipulators. It's not about aggressive, controlling, or caricatured people. It's about those who seem normal, reliable, even pleasant. And yet, they pass through you. Here, you will understand what is the first limit that these people test, because he is almost invisible. And most of all, because you've probably let this happen more than once. And no, it doesn't say you're weak. It says you are human. Because manipulators don't start by dominating you. They start measuring you, testing how much you tolerate, how much you give in, how silent you are. And all of this happens before you even realize you are being tested. There is a silent pattern, a pattern that goes unnoticed by most people. But when you see it, you can't unsee it anymore. And here's something that might bother you. The first limit you miss is not imposed. It is granted. You deliver, without realizing it, no resistance. Now think with me. Have you ever felt that slight discomfort in a situation, but decided to ignore it? That strange feeling in your body, a nuisance that is difficult to explain, as if something was out of place? And yet, you stayed. He continued talking. He continued listening. He continued to be polite. Why? This question changes everything. Because manipulators don't enter by forcing doors. They enter when they find doors ajar. And most people live like this, with too flexible limits, disguised as kindness. There is no judgment here. If you've been through this, you're not alone. Many more people experience this than they realize. In fact, maybe you are living this right now. Maybe there is someone in your life who constantly puts you in small, uncomfortable situations, and you always find a way to justify it. But it wasn't bad. Maybe I'm exaggerating. It's not worth creating conflict. These phrases seem harmless, but they are the perfect ground. And if you pay attention, you will realize that everything starts small, so small that you ignore it, so subtle that you accept it, so light that you don't even call it disrespect. It just is. And here's where most fail. It's not about what the other person does first. It's about what you allow to continue. If this type of reflection is already reminding you of someone or some situation, keep it, because what comes now will make it even clearer, and maybe a little uncomfortable too, but necessary. Because understanding this not only protects you, how it completely changes the way you see people. And after that, you will never look at certain behaviors the same way again. The first limit never seems dangerous. It comes disguised as something small, almost irrelevant. An out-of-time comment, a slightly uncomfortable joke, a subtle invasion of space, emotional or even physical. Nothing enough for you to react firmly. And that's exactly why it works. For a manipulator, this moment is not random. It's calculation. He's not trying to control you yet. You're trying to understand how far you can go without reacting. And here comes one of the most dangerous illusions. You believe you are being kind, when in fact it is being tested. Think with me. If someone crosses your limit and you don't react, what does that communicate? It's not just okay, it's something much deeper. That's acceptable with me. And that changes everything. Because from that point on, there is no longer any doubt on the other side. There is a map of your silence, of your tolerance, your difficulty in saying no. And manipulators know how to read this with frightening precision. Now pay attention to this. They don't start out asking for much. They start by asking for little, so little, that denying it seems exaggerated, and then comes that automatic thought. It doesn't cost anything, but it costs. It costs a chunk of your limit. It costs a small adjustment in your own perception of what is acceptable. And the most disturbing thing, you don't even notice when this adjustment happens. Suddenly, what used to bother you, it doesn't seem that serious anymore. And not because it changed, but because you changed the way of interpreting it. This has a name within behavioral psychology. It's called progressive desensitization, a process where repeating small violations reduces your emotional reaction. In other words, you get used to what should bother you. Now make this more direct. You don't get stronger. You become more tolerant of disrespect. And this difference is brutal, because as long as you believe you are handling things better, in fact, it is opening up space. Room for more. Always more. Now answer me, honestly. How many times have you thought, it's not that serious, when deep down something said it was? This internal conflict is not weakness. It's a warning. But most people learn to ignore this warning too soon. Learn that reacting can generate discomfort, that imposing limits can drive people away, that saying no can seem rude. Então escolhe o caminho mais fácil. Give in, adjust, to swallow. But manipulators count on exactly that. They don't need you to agree with everything. They just need you not to interrupt. And here comes a phrase that almost no one notices the moment it happens. Let it go. This sentence sounds like maturity, but in certain contexts, it is the beginning of loss. If you've ever found yourself saying this over and over again, maybe this is no coincidence. Maybe it's standard, and patterns are exactly what manipulators look for, because once identified, the next step is inevitable. They advance, slowly, no rush, without raising suspicion. And when you finally realize, is no longer dealing with a detail. You are dealing with an entire dynamic already established. And it all started there, in that first small moment where you decided not to react. Now note one important thing. It was not the intensity of the act that defined the beginning. Was his answer, or rather, her absence. If this is starting to make sense to you, don't ignore it. Because the next level of this dynamic, it no longer depends only on others. It depends on how your own mind starts to reorganize itself. And that's where things get really dangerous. There is a point at which this stops being just behavior and becomes engineering, not emotional, cognitive. Because manipulators don't just work with what you feel. They work with how you interpret what you feel. And that completely changes the game. Until now, it seemed like everything revolved around what the other person did. But now the perspective changes. The focus becomes you. Or rather, the way your mind begins, silently, to collaborate with the process. Yes, collaborate. And this is one of the most uncomfortable parts to understand, because no one likes to think that they participated in their own manipulation. But think calmly. When you justify someone else's behavior, quando você minimiza o que te incomodou, when you rationalize something that, deep down, you felt wasn't right, what are you doing? You are rearranging reality so that it is more bearable. And this has a very clear psychological explanation. There is a mechanism called cognitive dissonance. It happens when there is a conflict between what you feel and what you want to believe. For example, you feel uncomfortable with someone, but you want to believe that this person is good. These two things do not coexist easily. Then your mind resolves the conflict, adjusting perception. You start thinking, maybe I'm exaggerating. It wasn't a big deal. He didn't mean that. Do you understand what happened? The behavior has not changed, but his interpretation has changed. And this relieves the discomfort momentarily. But it has a price. You begin to doubt your own judgment. Now hold this. Manipulators don't need to change you directly. They just need to make you doubt what you have already realized. And when that happens, control begins to consolidate. Because from that point on, you no longer react based on how you feel. You react based on what you think you should feel, and that creates a dangerous distance between you and yourself. Now let me bring you something that few people know, but that changes everything. The human brain tends to preserve social bonds, even when they are harmful. Why? Because in evolutionary terms, belonging has always been safer than confrontation. So, when there is a risk of conflict, your internal system tries to reduce tension, and one of the most efficient ways to do this is to reinterpret the situation. In other words, you adapt. But here's the disturbing detail. This adaptation is not neutral. It takes you away from your own perception. And the more this happens, the harder it gets to trust what you feel. Now I want to ask you a question, and maybe it bothers you a little. Have you ever defended someone, while internally something inside you told you to stay away? Have you ever tried to explain someone's behavior to other people, even though I knew it didn't make sense? Have you ever felt like you were forcing a lighter interpretation just to keep the relationship stable? If the answer is yes, você não está sozinho nisso. Many people pass through this exact point, so without realizing it. And here on the channel, we don't pretend that this is rare. This is human, but it is also dangerous, because this is the exact moment when the manipulator stops testing and start building. Build a narrative where it doesn't seem wrong, where you look exaggerated, and where doubt always falls on you. And it doesn't need to be explicit. Sometimes it's a look, a silence, an ambiguous sentence. Little things, which accumulated, shape the way you interpret everything, including yourself. And when you realize, is no longer just tolerating minor limit breaks. You are participating in a system where your own internal signals have been weakened. This doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers, subtle, progressive, almost invisible, but extremely effective. And here comes the most important twist yet. The first limit was not just broken, it has been reprogrammed within you. Now, what would previously trigger an alert goes unnoticed, or worse, it becomes automatically justified. And this is where most people are already too involved to understand clearly. But there is a moment, a single moment, in which even with all this happening, something inside you still tries to warn you, and almost no one pays attention to him. There is a very specific moment, fast, almost imperceptible, where everything could stop, but it doesn't stop. Not because you didn't notice, but because you decided to ignore it. And it completely changes the way you understand what is happening, because until now, it seemed like everything was external, the other advancing, the other testing, the other invading. But this moment happens inside you. It's that second when something tightens in your chest, a slight but real annoyance, a feeling difficult to explain but impossible to deny. You feel, and this is the most important detail of all, you feel. Now pay attention to what happens right after. Your mind enters, quick, efficient, almost automatic. Calm down, it's no big deal. You don't need to take it personally. Maybe I'm reading it wrong. And suddenly, what was a sensation turns into doubt, and doubt becomes silence. Now I want you to mentally go back to some recent situation. It could be a conversation, an interaction, one comment, that moment when something in you reacted, but you decided not to show it. Can you remember? Maybe you got stuck for a second. Maybe he changed the subject. Maybe I laughed, even though I didn't think it was funny. Why? This question is not simple, because the answer is not unique. Sometimes it's fear of conflict. Sometimes it's fear of seeming exaggerated. Sometimes it's just habit. Yes, habit. The habit of prioritizing the comfort of others rather than your own perception. And this doesn't come out of nowhere. Most people have been conditioned to do so. To be understanding, avoiding tension, maintaining harmony. But there is a cost, and this cost appears exactly at that moment, when you feel, and yet, he remains silent. Now hold this. This is the most decisive point of the entire dynamic. It's not when the manipulator speaks. It's when you choose not to react to what you felt. Because there, something is recorded. Not just for the other, but for you. Your brain learns. Learn that that type of situation does not require a response. Learn that that discomfort can be ignored. And the more this happens, the more automatic it becomes. Now let me change perspective for a second. Imagine that, at that exact moment, someone was watching you from outside, seeing your reactions, seeing your silences, seeing the moments when you swallow something that bothered you. What would that person conclude about you? That you are patient, or that you are permissive, that you are mature, or that you avoid confrontation at all costs? This difference is subtle, but to a manipulator, it is crystal clear. Because it is in this type of detail that he understands exactly how to move forward, and he doesn't need verbal confirmation. Your behavior already responds. Now, go back inside yourself, because there is something that almost no one talks about at this moment. He doesn't disappear. You can ignore it right away. You can rationalize. You can move on. But that initial feeling, it is registered, and it often reappears later, in the form of annoyance, in the form of doubt, or even in the form of regret. I should have said, I felt like something was wrong. Why didn't I trust that? These questions don't come out of nowhere. They arise because, on some level, you knew, and that's important, because it means your internal system is still working. He didn't fail. He was ignored, and there is a huge difference between these two things. If you recognize yourself in this, if a scene is coming back to you right now, don't take it away. Because this is exactly where a lot of people start to wake up. Here, we don't treat this type of perception as weakness. We treat it as a sign. Sign that there is still something in you that realizes before you even understand. But this is also where the risk increases. Because once this pattern repeats itself, the next step is no longer subtle. It starts to expand. And when that happens, it's no longer about an isolated moment. It's about an entire sequence that you didn't even see form. At first, it felt isolated. A comment here, a discomfort there, little episodes that you could explain or ignore. But now, it's starting to gain frequency. And that changes everything. Because when something repeats itself, it stops being chance and becomes standard. And manipulators live by standards. Now let me ask you some questions. Quick, direct, almost uncomfortable. Have you started justifying yourself more than before? Have you avoided certain topics to avoid generating tension? Have you ever thought twice before saying something simple? Do you feel like you need to measure your words with someone specific? Have you ever stopped doing something just so you wouldn't have to deal with that person's reaction? Breathe. If more than one of these questions made sense, this is no coincidence. It's progression. And here a silent but extremely dangerous turning point takes place. You start to adapt even before the other person acts. Do you understand the level of this? Before, you reacted to what happened. Now, you anticipate, you calculate, you avoid it. And when that happens, the control is no longer external. It has been internalized. Now you no longer need direct pressure. You regulate your behavior yourself. And that, for a manipulator, is the ideal scenario, because he no longer needs to insist. You already understand, without him having to say it, how you should act to maintain harmony. But this harmony has an invisible cost. You are diminishing, little by little, without realizing it. What you would say, you swallow. What you would question, you let it go. What would bother you, you relativize it. And it all feels like maturity. But it's not. It's adaptation to constant discomfort. Now pay attention to this. When you start to shape yourself to avoid someone's reaction, you have already lost space in your own life. And this space doesn't disappear all at once. He's getting busy. First by the opinions of others, then by expectations, then the unpredictable reactions, until, one day, you realize that you are living within a field that is no longer yours. Now tell me, when was the last time you felt completely comfortable being yourself with this person? No filter, no calculation, no fear of interpretation. If you had to think a lot to answer, this already says more than any explanation, because freedom shouldn't require effort. Now observe what happens to your identity in this process. You start to adjust your tone, your way, your words, sometimes even your thoughts. Yes, thoughts. You start to mentally review what you are going to say before saying it. Start rehearsing answers. Start predicting scenarios. And that's tiring. But you continue, because somehow it seems easier than confronting. And that's when the trap closes. You are no longer just reacting to someone. You are living in order to not activate something in the other person. And that is exhausting. But there is an even deeper detail. You start to confuse it with choice. You think, I prefer to avoid conflict. I'm just like that. I don't like complications. But was this always the case? Or did this start to form along these small concessions? Here we don't ignore these types of questions, because it reveals something essential. Not all adaptation is growth. Some are silent survival. And the more you adapt, the less you realize how far you have already moved away from yourself. Now hold this carefully. The most effective control is not the one that holds you back. It's the one that makes you not want to leave. Because it looks comfortable. It seems stable. It seems safe. But it's not. It's just predictable. And predictability in this context, it's just another form of limitation. If you're starting to notice this pattern, if something here is triggering an internal alert, don't ignore it. Because the next stage of this dynamic, it no longer just involves behavior. It involves something deeper. It involves the way you begin to see yourself. And when that changes, everything changes together. And then, something even quieter happens, and much more dangerous. You start to blame yourself. Not in an obvious way, not with direct sentences, but in small thoughts, almost imperceptible. Maybe I'm exaggerating. I misunderstood. If I were calmer, this wouldn't happen. Do you notice the change? Before, the behavior came from outside. Now, the criticism comes from within. And this completely changes the structure of the relationship. Because when you start to doubt yourself, you stop trusting your own judgment. And without that, any limit becomes fragile. Now let me show you how this is built. It doesn't happen all at once. Nobody wakes up one day and decides to blame themselves for everything. This is planted, little by little, in subtle phrases, in calculated reactions, in specific moments where you are already vulnerable. A comment here. Wow, you take everything so personally. Another one there. You complicate simple things. And sometimes it's not even said directly. It's a sigh, a look of impatience, a charged silence after you get into position. And that's it. That's enough. Because your brain starts to register a pattern. If I position myself, it creates discomfort. If I question, I am the problem. Now hold this. The manipulator does not need to accuse you directly. He just needs to make you come to that conclusion on your own. And when that happens, control reaches another level. Because now he is no longer the one who needs to adjust you. And you start to watch yourself. Review what you said. Think about what you could have done differently. Ask yourself if you exaggerated. And that feels like emotional responsibility. But in this context, it's distortion. Because there is a clear difference between reflecting and blame yourself for feeling. And that line starts to disappear. Now I want to ask you a question, and answer honestly. How many times have you left a conversation feeling wrong, even without being able to explain exactly why? Not knowing what he did wrong, but with the feeling that he did it. This is one of the strongest signs of psychological inversion. When discomfort has no clear form, but it still falls on you. And here is the most confusing point. There is no specific moment where this becomes evident. It's gradual. You will, little by little, take on responsibilities that are not yours. It absorbs tensions that it did not create. You're trying to balance something that was never in your hands, and in the meantime, the other remains stable, safe, coherent, convinced, and this further reinforces your doubt. Because if the other one seems so right, maybe the mistake really lies with you. Right? Wrong. But the feeling is this. And sensation, at this point, weighs more than logic. Now observe the impact of this on your identity. You start to see yourself as difficult, too sensitive, too reactive. Start to reduce your own perception to fit the narrative that was constructed. And that is one of the most dangerous things that can happen. Because when you lose confidence in yourself, you lose the main protection mechanism that exists. Now any limit can be questioned. Any inconvenience may be invalidated. Any sensation can be discarded. And this makes room for something even deeper. You stop recognizing yourself. Now tell me, have you ever found yourself apologizing? Not sure why? Have you ever tried to fix a situation, even though you know it didn't start with you? Have you ever felt like you needed to prove that you weren't wrong, even without understanding the accusation? If this has already happened, don't treat it like something small, because it isn't. Here, we look at this clearly. Without softening, without romanticizing, because this is the point where a lot of people are already completely involved, without realizing it. And the most disturbing thing, even at this stage, still looks normal. It still seems justifiable. It still seems like it can be handled. But it doesn't work. Because from here, it's no longer just about what you accept. It's about who you believe you are. And when this starts to be shaped, the impact goes far beyond the relationship. Go inside, and it changes everything. But there is something specific that interrupts this cycle. And when that appears, the whole dynamic changes. But almost no one sustains this for long. There is a point at which all this can stop, but it's not comfortable, it's not natural, and for most people, it's not sustainable. This is where the limit that manipulators really fear comes in. It's not screaming, it's not aggressively confronting, it's not proving you're right. It's something much simpler and much more difficult. It's not giving in. Just that. No long explanation. No emotional justification, without trying to be understood. Just don't give in. It seems little, but it completely breaks the logic of the game. Because manipulators operate with expectations. They expect adjustment. They expect adaptation. They hope that, at some point, you will return to standard. And when that doesn't happen, something hangs. Now pay attention to the change. Before you explain too much, I tried to balance. I tried to keep the peace. Now, you sustain. Without raising the tone, without entering into dispute, without trying to convince, just keep it. And this creates a type of discomfort that cannot be easily handled, because there is no material for distortion. There is no justification for it to be used against you. There is no emotional excess to be explored. There is only one clear limit, and that destabilizes. Now I'm going to be straight with you. The problem is not setting this limit, it's supporting him. Because the moment you do that, the reaction comes. It can be subtle, a departure, an awkward silence, a change in behavior. Or it could be more direct, an attempt to make you feel guilty, a quick reversal, an emotional pressure disguised as worry. And here's the real test. You go back, or does it remain? This choice defines everything. Because manipulators don't just test limits, they test for consistency. If you back down once, the pattern is confirmed. If you keep, the pattern breaks. Simple, but not easy. Now let me ask you, how many times have you tried to position yourself and then went back to avoid discomfort? How many times have you set a limit and, faced with the other's reaction, softened? This is more common than it seems, and it's not weakness, it's conditioning. But this is also exactly what keeps the cycle going. Now note one important thing. When you sustain a limit of truth, two things can happen. Or the person adjusts, or she walks away. And both answers are revealing, because those who respect don't need to be convinced, and who depends on your constant flexibility. You won't be able to survive without it. Here, we don't romanticize this. Losing ties hurts. Creating tension is uncomfortable. Sustaining limits requires energy, but it also reveals. Reveal who was there for the relationship, and who was there for control. Now hold this sentence. Limit is not about pushing people away. It's about revealing who only stays when you diminish yourself. Isso muda a forma como você enxerga tudo, because it stops being about pleasing, and it becomes about preserving. And preserving is not selfish, it's structure. Now, perhaps the hardest part, remain silent, without giving in. Don't explain too much. Don't try to be understood. Don't go into long justifications. Just support. And that, at first, seems wrong. It looks cold. It looks strange. It seems like you're being too harsh. But it isn't. You are being clear. And clarity is not something manipulators handle well, because it eliminates room for distortion. Now tell me, if you started acting like this today, how many relationships would remain exactly as they are? This question is not comfortable, but it is necessary, because the answer shows how much of what you experience today depends on your lack of limit. And when you realize that, you can't pretend you didn't see it anymore. And that's exactly where that consciousness truly begins. But it comes with a price, and not everyone is willing to pay. And this is where almost everyone backs off. Not because he didn't understand, but because he understood too much. Because from the moment you see, you can no longer pretend you don't know. And this changes the weight of each decision. Before, you gave in without realizing it. Now, you realize before you give in. And this interval, this small space of consciousness, this is where everything is decided. But it also brings discomfort, because now you see what previously went unnoticed. Understand the tone, notice the pattern, notice the repetition, and most of all, you understand. Realize when you are about to shut up. Cuando está prestes a suavizar. When you're about to give up something, just to avoid tension. And at that moment, it's no longer possible to say it was accidental. Now let me ask you a question, and don't answer quickly. Who is testing your limits today, without you fully realizing it? It could be someone close. It could be someone subtle. It could be someone you still defend. And that's the hardest thing to accept. Because not every manipulator seems dangerous. Some seem necessary. Now observe the impact of this on your life as a whole. How many decisions have you made trying to avoid someone's reaction? How many times have you adjusted your way of being to maintain a stable relationship? How many versions of you were left along the way without you realizing? If these questions made you stop for a second, this is already a sign. Here, we don't look for quick answers. We seek awareness, and conscience often bothers, but it also frees. Because when you start to see patterns, you stop reacting automatically. You get to choose. And choosing changes everything. But let me be honest with you. Seeing is not enough. Muita gente percebe e continua. Keep giving in. Keep adapting. He continues to ignore his own discomfort. Why? Because sustaining consciousness requires something that almost no one talks about. Silent courage. Not that explosive confrontational courage, but the courage to maintain a limit, even when no one validates it. And that is lonely. Now think with me. If this video reminded you of situations, of people, or even patterns of yours that you had never named, don't keep it to yourself. There are many people living exactly this, without understanding what is happening. Sometimes a conversation changes everything. Sometimes a shift in perception opens up a path that seemed invisible. If something here marked you, share it with someone who also needs to see this. Because this type of consciousness is not common, and whoever starts to notice starts to break out of the pattern. Now I want to hear you. No filter. When was the most recent time you felt like you should have drawn a line? Didn't you put them in? It could be something small. It may be something that is still bothering you. Put it into words. Because often, just recognizing, you are already starting to recover space, and if at any point in this process you realize that you are about to go back to automatic, come back here, rewatch, remember, repositions itself. This is not about perfection, it's about continuous awareness. And if you made it this far, you are already a few steps ahead of most, not because he knows more, but because he started to see, and who sees no longer accepts anything. Now the last question, and perhaps the most important of all, when the next limit is tested, will you notice? Or are you going to call it no big deal? Yet again. The answer? It's not in the video. It's the next moment when something in you says, that's not right. And this time, you decide whether to listen or ignore yourself again.